This Norton shouldn't exist. No CNC machines, no fancy shop, just one guy in his garage in Auburn, Washington with a vision.
What time is it? It's time to ride.
I'm Todd Souza, and today we're diving deep into Otto Jorgenson's hand-built tribute to Ron Wood's legendary Big Tube Nortons. This isn't just a build story. This is about respect, craftsmanship, and what happens when a kid grew up racing flat track finally gets to honor his heroes. So, winter 23, Otto cleared his garage and got to work.
Hi, this is Otto Jorgenson, 67 years old and from Auburn, Washington. I'm riding this fancy Norton that I built. We're riding it tonight here at Cycleland Speedway in the Legends class. Hope to see you guys someday out here.
We grew up in Bellevue, Washington. So it all started Christmas morning of 1966. My parents gave my brothers a Yamaha 80 for Christmas. That was the beginning of my motorcycle addiction. So we started out riding the Yamaha 80, and we'd take turns. There was an old garbage dump near my parents' house, and so we'd go out and tear that up every weekend and trade off. We each got 10 minutes. No cheating supposedly, but there was always some arguments about who got more time than who didn't. Anyway, so a year later, there was a kids race at the indoor short track that my dad was racing at. He hauled that Yamaha out there, and we put a paper plate, number plate on the front, number 77. And I was too short. I'm a short guy anyway, but back then I was really short. And he had to hold me up on the starting line. Anyway, so that night I ended up getting second in the kids' race. Got a trophy and all that stuff, and that was the hook for going racing. My dad was a really good teacher, and, eventually taught me how to weld, and we got a little lathe and a little mill. And he showed me how to, machine stuff. And then when I got into junior high, I took metal shop. And then, of course, high school was, auto mechanics and metal shop and wood shop and all the shops you could take, electronics. And so that's kind of my start. And I started building bikes in 1971 when I was still in high school. Graduated in 75. So it just kind of evolved from my dad teaching me down in the basement to eventually going to technical welding school and then getting a job at Boeing eventually. Although my first welding job out of welding school was welding crab pots like they have on the Deadliest Catch TV show, those giant crab pots. That was my first paid welding job when I got out of school. The next day I'm welding crab pots down in Seattle, and my boss comes up and says, "Hey, your mom's on the phone. There's something, big is going on." And I pick up the phone and talk to my mom, and she says, "You got to get down to the Boeing employment office. They got a job for you." So that was my start in aircraft. Through all those years, 40 years at Boeing, I learned a lot of skills and pushed myself to learn new things and have different jobs there, and kind of broaden my horizons in machining and forming and welding and CAD design and all of that. I'm guessing over the years I've probably built 40 bikes. Some of them were ground-up builds. In the 80s, I built a frame jig and built a bunch of Rotex 500 frames and complete bikes for a bunch of local guys. Drag bike, funny bike frames for Sandy Cosman from Cosman Specialties. Did some road race bikes. Did a lot of engine swap stuff where you put a different engine in a different frame. Learned how to do custom painting and, machining and welding. And my first recollections of the Ron Wood Norton was probably in Cycle newspaper. We kept track of all the national flat track stuff around, and we would go down and watch Sacramento and San Jose miles, and then as I got a little older, we'd go to Ascot and go down and watch the half mile and the TT Nationals down at Ascot. And I think it was either at San Jose or the Ascot half mile where I actually saw the original bike. And I remember walking through the pits and seeing that shiny red bike that looked different than the Harleys and the Yamahas and the DSAs and the Triumphs, and it was a Norton. And up here, nobody was really racing Norton, so it was like, wow, that's cool. With the big tube and the cutout and the seat and just all the lightning holes and the way it was built. All those years of racing and building bikes and stuff for everybody else, I never really had time to take on a giant project like that. And then when I retired from Boeing, I had time, and I thought, I always admired that bike, and I think I'll build one. And that's kind of how it started, And I was kind of out of projects, and I got this wild hair to do this Norton, and boom, boom, boom. Next thing you knew, I found an engine down in L.A. and got my daughter to pick that up, and then just started researching and trying to find pictures and information on the Ron Wood Norton. Once I had gotten some drawings made up, the next piece was trying to get the tubes bent, for the big backbone, the 3-inch 4130 tubing. And I researched all over the Northwest, trying to find somebody that had a machine that would do 3-inch on a really tight bend radius. They needed to have good tooling, a good machine. So anyway, I finally found a place in Portland, Oregon that said they could do it. And so we took them down some material. And so I had them bend up too, just in case I made a mistake somewhere and had to scrap one out. So we went down to pick it up, and oh man, what a disappointment. So we drug those frame tubes home, and that was kind of the point in the build where I almost threw in the towel. One morning I woke up and it's like I just had a dream, and it's like, okay, I know how I'm going to do it. I'm gonna cut decent pieces of bends out of the two frames that I have, and I'm gonna weld straight pieces to them, and I'm gonna just make a Frankenstein backbone out of the junk that I got. And once I got that going and all those pieces welded together and the basic backbone laying down there, then it just started popping. From there, you put on the steering head and doing the swing arm pivot and all the oil fittings and steering stops and all the doublers for the motor mounts. And then it got to the point where it was time to stand it up and start putting the tubes for the seat base and the shock mounts and all that stuff on. I just made a real simple jig and used a laser to find the center line and keep everything straight. And then from there, I built the swing arm, finished the swing arm pivot and the shock mount. And that was kind of like a monument, you got this major portion done. And now you're just going to start dressing it up with all the other components that have to go into it. But at that point, the major part of the build, in my opinion, was pretty much done. You were over the hump. Everything on the frame and the swing arm is chromoly. Swing arm is 1 inch by 1.5 inches, 065 wall chromoly. Main tube of the frame, the backbone, is 3-inch 049 wall 4130, so it's very thin. in tubing, you get your strength from the diameter more than you get it from the wall thickness. So as your diameter goes up, your wall thickness can go way down, and that's how we get away with running the 049 real thin wall tubing for that backbone. On the Norton, the engine and the transmission are separate. It's called a non-unit. The first trick on making these motor mounts and getting them on the frame was making sure that once you got the motor in and got the motor plates located and tack welded, that you could get the engine and transmission back out. That was the first challenge, and that took a little bit of finessing. There were a few places where I didn't quite have enough clearance for the engine to be able to swing up and out, and so I had to relieve a little bit on some of those motor plates, and the same thing with the transmission. So it wasn't just make cardboard templates and cut them out of metal and weld them on and drop the motor in. It was like, okay, I got the motor in, and I put the templates on, but I got to make sure that I can get the motor and the transmission back out. Otherwise, you just welded your motor into your frame. Everything on this is all TIG-welded. It's all of the tubing, the swing arm and the frame was all purged with argon internally. It's all welded with ER70 S2 mild steel filler so that the weld joints are not brittle. They've got some ductility by using the mild steel filler. And then with everything being purged, you get no oxide, no scale on the inside to interfere with your oil system. The frame is actually the oil tank. That orifice there is where you put the oil in. And then the oil returns from the engine up high on the front of the down tube. So that helps with the cooling. But that also, what that does, it naturally runs down and it takes the bubbles, the aeration out of the oil. So by the time the oil makes it to the bottom of the frame, the sump, there's hardly any air in the oil, and it's had a chance to cool down. So it's actually kind of a natural oil cooler. There's a drain plug on the very bottom back bend where it heads up to the swing arm pivot, and then there's a filler up by the steering stop. Oil capacity was pretty simple. It's just a calculation of the area of the tubing. I wanted to run 3.5 quarts of oil, and I wanted it to always be, well above the pickup, so you never starve the engine for oil. So 3.5 quarts basically fills that bottom tube up to the top of the first bend on both the front and the back. So that basically that whole tube is full of oil when you're riding it. Some of the final assembly pictures, I've added a spin-on canister oil filter, because in the Norton, the only oil filter that came from the factory is there's an oil slinger inside the crank, basically. So they use the centrifugal force of the crankshaft spinning around to make the heavier particles stick to the outer bore of this passageway. The centrifugal force flings the heavier metal shavings or chips or whatever you got going on in there, and it sticks it into this slippage trap that's in the center of the crankshaft. I knew where the upper shock mount had to be. I knew where I wanted the seat to be based on Ron's spike. And then I just kind of connected the dots and I put some tube in the bender and, made the first one, and it wasn't quite right, but I knew what I needed to change. And the second one I bent up, and that's what you see. Like I said, the more you look at this thing, the more detail there is, and the more, the more worms are in the can. Brake pedal and the linkage, the arm that comes down off the master cylinder, that's not the stock one. That's, of course, I had to take and make that one a titanium plate with lightning holes. And then I used the real nice aluminum red anodized heim joints. I had never formed a compound contour aluminum gas tank before. I had made tanks tanks that kind of looked like the Knight style or the Champion style or a CZ or Mako coffin tank that were all kind of flat panels with, a little bit of curves. But on this Norton tank, I wanted it to look like on Ron's first big tube, he used, I think he used a Norton High Rider tank. And his second one, he used a Yamaha YZ tank. Originally, I was going to use the YZ tank, and the ones that I did found were in really bad shape, and the guys wanted $1 million for them because they thought they had gold. So I decided I would build it like Ron's first tank, like the High Rider tank. I bought an English wheel years ago and never really used it much, and I bought a shot bag and all kinds of plastic mallets, and I figured, okay. So I got some aluminum and I started beating on this thing on the shot bag, and it was like, dude, this is hard. And I tried to make half a tank, and I beat on that thing for days. I would needle it with the torch and then beat it some more, and then finally I got to the point where I could work it with the English wheel. It was starting to look like a tank, and I thought, wow, okay, this isn't too bad. But that was like 3 or 4 days, It wasn't like the guys on TV where they whip a tank out in, 45 minutes or whatever. 3 days later, I get the first half done, and I spend another 3 days probably making the other half. I didn't really learn a whole lot other than it's real easy to pinch your fingers when you use an English wheel. As you're rolling the sheet metal between these two wheels, if you go too far and you're holding onto the sheet metal, you pinch your fingers. So after pinching my fingers a million times, I kind of started to learn how to do the English wheel. Anyway, long story is I was pretty excited. I tacked the two halves together and I went to put them on the frame, and I realized, number one, it was too fat, and number two, it was too short. And I'm like, oh crap. Took my bandsaw and I cut the thing down the middle and narrowed it up, and then I cut it in half, and I made some more panels and welded them in. Finally, I got the shape of the tank done to where it looked right. And then from there, it was just a matter of fabbing the tunnel and welding all the fittings in. So then I had the tank. So the tank is all painted. It's first primed with chromate primer, like airplane stuff. It's green, and then painted the red color base coat, and then I laid out the black stripe and painted that, and then I laid out the white stripe and painted that, and then I cut out the Norton and the Otco stickers on my vinyl cutter. I have a small vinyl cutter, and that's how I did the numbers too, and stick them on, and then it's got 2 coats of clear. So none of these pictures show the hole that's drilled through the top and bottom of the tank, and then there's a machined boss that's welded in the top and bottom, and there's a center bolt that goes through and slides into that. On the backbone of the frame, there's a piece of square tubing that's been cut down and slotted, and that's where your bolt goes in to fasten the gas tank down. It's all rubber mounted. There's a foam rubber pipe insulation that goes over the tube, and then the tank slides down on top of that. So it's all cushioned with rubber. I actually built the tank first, and then I fitted the seat to fit the subframe and tuck in real nice to the back of the tank. I made the seat frame, I bonded foam onto it, I sanded the foam, and then I sent it down there in Northern California to make a nice leather seat cover for it. That's really about the only parts on the bike that I didn't actually make. Other than triple clamps, handlebars, wheels. I went through some stuff on the internet and found some pictures of the Woods Norton without the engine in it or the tank or the seat on it. So it had the forks and the frame and the swing arm and the shocks. And I actually took it down to the office supply place, and I had them blow it up. I knew that the forks were 35 millimeters. I knew that the backbone was 3-inch diameter. I knew how big a 19-inch rim is. So I scaled a bunch of stuff on the picture, and then I translated that to a full-size drawing of the frame and forks and wheels. For example, the cutout for the front wheel would hit the down tube. Well, back in the Ron Woods day, your front tire was either a Pirelli originally or later on a first generation Goodyear. And they were smaller diameters than today's tires. And so when I translated Ron's clearances, I realized that with today's modern Dunlop or whatever tire your choice is, they're too big and they would have hit the frame. If you took Ron Wood's Norton and put a modern tire on the front and collapsed the forks all the way, you would hit the frame on his actual Big Tube Norton. So that's where, by making the full-scale paper drawing I put in the travel of the suspension to make sure that my pivots were in the right place, that my frame clearance was going to work out. And so all of that was done on paper before I ever started cutting metal. I think there's a picture in there. You'll see me of my face is all black. That's from polishing forks and side covers, and all the aluminum pieces are polished. But on the Yamaha forks, I machined off it was set up for dual front calipers, so it had bungs on both fork legs, and then it had some fender mounts up above. I machined all that stuff off and then polished all that. So the front forks are Yamaha R6, and you need to extend them about an inch to get all the geometry to work. So you take them apart and you extend the dampener rods and put them back together, and you get a little bit less tube overlap, but you get an inch longer front end. I went with dual shocks, A, for simplicity, but B, in the spirit of the Woods type Nortons. Basic hub bought from KE Motorsports down in Nevada. He sold a pretty nice quick change hub, but then I modified those to add another outboard bearing. So wheel ends up having 4 bearings in it instead of 2, and the outer bearings on the edges of the knockoffs, it makes it more stiff. The axle is shorter where it's flexing. Called Buchanan's and ordered stainless spokes and nipples and laced them up and trued them. The front rear axle and the swing arm pivots are all machined out of 6AL4V titanium bar stock. All of the steel frame parts are all powder coated. I have a friend down here in Auburn, Sean, down at American Powder Coating. We've been swapping business for 30 years, and he takes care of all my powder coating. That's actually a Honda red that ended up being a really nice color, similar to what Ron painted his Norton stuff with. That fender is actually from England, and I don't know if it's a BSA or a Triumph, a Norton, or who knows what it is, but I went on a website at Andover Norton, and they had aluminum fenders, and I found one that had the right radius and the right width, and it had the little lip on the end, so it was a finished type fender. I had looked around up here in Washington for a Norton Commando motor. I wanted a Commando motor for a couple reasons. One, the parts were fairly available, and up until I think about 71, you could get a Norton and you could have a mag off the center case that went behind the cylinders, and I wanted to run a mag, behind the cylinders. So in doing some research, 71 was about the last year you could run a mag, that the cases were machined for a mag. And so I found a 71 Commando motor down in Los Angeles. I wheeled and dealed with the guy. He initially wanted too much money for it, and then I told him, well, I don't want the pipes and the carbs and the clutch cable and all of that stuff. I just want the engine and transmission. I think I paid $1,000 for it. And so he jumped all over that. The deal worked out good. The guy was really nice. And so I had a motor. I just had to get down to San Diego to get it. And so when we went down and visited, we picked up the Norton motor and brought it back. And of course, after I got done mocking the frame up and using it for all of that, I tore it all apart, sandblasted the cases, did some machine work, reed valve, breather on the bottom, adapt the new Hunt magneto, figured out how to run the magneto on a non-magneto engine. The engine had casting made for the magneto, but it didn't have any of the chain drive or the mechanicals to run the magneto. So I did some research and figured out what I needed to machine and what gears I needed to get from Norton in order to run the magneto. And from there, I had picked out rods and pistons that I wanted to run. I wanted to get a set of aluminum barrels that were Nicoso-coated bores. They saved about 11 pounds. And for a dirt tracker, that's pretty good. They were available in England from a guy, Molar Precision Products. Once I got all the parts and then knew what I needed to machine, the cam lobes were bigger, so I had to bore out the cam tunnel, and I got done. I machined a few parts for the chain drive for the magneto, and I got that all sorted out. And then I started putting the cases back together. The crank in, rods in, and I put the pistons on, and I went to put the barrels on. And I got the barrels over the pistons, but they were too big to go into the crankcase. And it turns out that the aluminum barrels have a bigger diameter spigot on the bottom than the stock Norton ones. So they don't fit 750 cases. They fit the 850 cases. So here I am with an engine halfway put together and the barrels won't go on. And I'm like, oh, you got to be kidding. And nobody ever said anything. I never read anything. So I tear the crankcases apart and I put them back together and put them up on my mill, and I bore the cases out to fit the new cylinders. And clean everything all up, put it all back together, and then start reassembling the engine. That was probably the major hiccup that I had. The cases and the actual crankshaft are Norton. Everything else is aftermarket. It's got Carrillo rods. It's got JE pistons. It's got the standard Norton cam followers are replaced with a bronze plug that uses BSA lifters that are much lighter, so you can rev the thing better without floating the valves. There's really nothing other than the cases and the crank that are Norton. Everything else after that pretty much bolted right up. I went with a dry belt drive clutch, the full auto, full CNC machine, brand new cylinder head with real trick valves and all that stuff in it. The head is what they call a full auto. It's an aftermarket head that's cast to look like the stock Norton head. The ports are all done on a CNC mill, and the combustion chambers, everything is CNC milled. So it has a modern exhaust port with the raised floor and the D port, they call it. And the intake ports are raised for more performance also. So not only do you get a head with modern aluminum casting technology and alloys, but then you get a fully CNC machined intake and exhaust and combustion chamber. So there's supposed to be a performance gain by running that head. It's got modern bronze valve guides and beryllium seat, and it takes care of not having to port the head and do all that stuff. So longer rods and a lighter pistons I put in, the balance factor actually worked to the advantage for a rigid mounted engine. The Norton is isostatically mounted in rubber biscuits. A normal engine in a Norton sits there and shakes while the frame sits perfectly still. The engine is rubber mounted, but in the dirt tracker everything is rigid mounted. So by running the longer rods and the lighter pistons, it changed the balance factor of the stock crank to work good for an engine mounted in a rigid frame. So I didn't have to rebalance it. I took and had it magnafluxed to make sure there were no cracks, and took it all apart and cleaned that. I was talking about the stock Norton uses the passage through the middle of the crank as a centrifugal oil filter, a sludge trap they call it. So I did take the crank apart and clean the 50 years of sludge out of the middle of the crank so that all that stuff wouldn't get run through the rod bearings and the main bearings. The first exhaust I made was like Ron Wood's twin exhausts that both exited on the right-hand side. Pretty cool design, and I really liked it. I thought it really looked neat, and so I built the two right-side megaphones, and unfortunately, up here and probably in most places, you have to run mufflers. So that added about 8 inches to the end of the megaphones that the Woods Norton never had to deal with. Ultimately, I got the pipes all done, and they were really cool and sound cool and everything, but the first time I wrote them, I realized that they drag. There were actually 3 iterations of exhaust on this Norton. The first with the 2 pipes on the right, and then I left 1 pipe on the right and built another pipe on the left, low pipe. Come to find out, I guess I leaned the bike over farther than I thought in the garage, and on the track, the left pipe would drag. So after building another set of pipes, I finally decided, okay, I'm done with this. I'm just going to build a really nice set of high pipe megaphones. And so today's final rendition has the high pipes. I think when we showed up at Chico and or Cycle Land, the video you have of starting the bike there has the high pipes on it. The day finally arrived when everything was done. The remote starter was done. The bike was done. So I wheeled it out and put gas in it and turned the petcocks on and plugged in the electric starter. And I figured, okay, I'm probably going to have to crank and crank and crank. And the thing, I hit the button and the bike started up. And I was like, whoa. It was like the Frankenstein movie where he zaps him and Frankenstein comes to life, and it's like, it's alive! It's pretty cool.
Okay.
Just relief and joy, all of the emotions all at once. And to sit there and rev it a little and listen to that song.
And it sounds so good.
Yeah, it does sound very good. It's very healthy.
What was running it like for the first time after all those hours?
So the first time we took it to the races was Castle Rock, and it was a TT night. That ended up being a pretty short night because I went out for practice and I took it real easy the first lap. You know, a brand new bike, and I'm not a teenager, and you know, hadn't ridden a big bike for a long time. Anyway, I went around on the first lap, and it wasn't bad. And the second lap, I went a little faster, and I went through the left-hander, and then there's a real sharp right-hander, and then the jump. And I leaned it over for the right-hander, and the thing about pitched me off. And I thought, wow, I must have hit a slick spot or something, or maybe I gassed it up too hard. Anyway, so I didn't think too much. Came around the next lap and went through the right-hander and just about pitched me off. And I realized, oh no, it's dragging the pipes. And sure enough, I ran it back into the pits, put it up on the stand, and looked at the back of the super trap on the bottom, and all the paint was ground off, and the baffles of the super trap were full of clay. So the right hand pipe was dragging. So that was the end of the first night. We parked it, and then I built the second set of pipes that we talked about, with the one on the left and one on the right. And that was going to be a short track, just an oval night. And the same thing, I went out on practice, and this one time I was, much more confident because it wasn't a TT. And by the second or third lap of practice, I realized that now the left pipe dragged. And it was like, okay. So that's when I went back and made the high pipes. So the third race was a TT again. And that was the first night that I really got to run it hard. I was happily amazed that it didn't do any funny things. It wasn't squirrely. It didn't push the front end. The slides were pretty controllable. It didn't try and pogo or anything. So I knew we were in the right ballpark, and then we could start playing with gearing and suspension and jetting and all of that stuff. So that was really the first time I got to really get on and ride it was the third night.
How many races have you raced it since you built it?
Yeah, we might have ran it 10 times now.
Have you changed anything on it other than the exhaust pipes from Dragon?
Yeah, we changed to the high pipes. We actually went down one size on carburetors. We were running 38 Dellortos. We would have trouble when the weather changed. It would affect the jetting. So we went down to 36s and picked up some velocity so the things carburate better, and they're not as touchy with the weather. Then we added the Race Tech shocks, and we've been playing with the R6. Is pretty neat. You can add more preload to the springs, and you can play with the dampening. So we've actually, each race we've gone out and made a few changes and kind of noted what it did or didn't do. It's hard to know how hard the thing really turns. So we added a digital tack with a memory, so we can see how hard we turned it. Gosh, other than that, we're pretty much just ready to get on it and learning the bike a little more, and then just out having fun. Proud of the way that everything came together. It's been a long journey, a lot of years learning how to do all this stuff, and I had told myself when I started this build that it may be my last build, and I wanted it to be my best. So I was very meticulous. Every weld is nice, every bolt, every lightning hole, every facet of the bike I put 100% into. And the result at the end was you just stand back and admire it. The more you look, the more detail you see, and the more detail you see, the more you want to look, and it's like it just never ends. So we ended up winning the last race of the season at Castle Rock, and we had a heck of a battle with a couple of of guys on 500 or 600 singles that we've been battling all year, back and forth. It was pretty cool. We got the win, and the guys came up and congratulated, and they were impressed at how we got the Norton running finally. You know, we got everything dialed in, and it was pretty fun. It was cool to win, and get your juices flowing, and that kind of makes it easy to go through the winter. You know, you're ready to pick it up next year. It was a tribute to Ron and his design and his fabrication and his aesthetic eye, and that's what I tried to put into this, is a bike that would represent that era and that time, and not to be a copy. I don't want anybody to think that it was, some guy up there in Washington made a copy of the Ron Wood Norton, because it's not a copy. It's got some modern things. It's got some little twists and turns that he didn't have, that I had, and yet he had things that I don't have. So it's really a kid fulfilling his dream, 50 years later, and that's what I want people to think when they see it.
If Ron Wood was to see this bike, what would you hope he'd say?
I think, first off, I would hope that he would stop and look at it, and I would hope that he would look at it and smile and say, well done. And I would love to say, you were the inspiration from when I was a teenager. All of the things that you built were just so amazing. And you inspired not only other racers and builders and fans. The whole flat track community was kind of touched by the stuff that he did, and how nice his stuff was. And I think for him to stop and look at my bike and say, well done, would just be the biggest compliment that I could ever get.
Who's your favorite racer?
My favorite racer would probably be Alex Jorgenson. This is kind of a tribute to him and Rob Morrison, the Ron Wood riders from back in the day.
It's time to ride with Todd Souza. Find him on Facebook, find him on Instagram, find him on YouTube, find him all over all the social media. Ask him what time it is, because it is always time to ride with Todd Souza.